The Rings of Power is basically falling into acolyte territory, and we're going to cover that more next week, or in the next few days, depending on when I get some time. But Rings of Power has failed to deliver in many ways, and its derivative nature screams through. So let's talk about it. I'm Will, I'm the host of the Book Geek, and here is just an opinion piece. All my links and info are down below, and if you want exclusive or early access to content, please consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. So let's start the show. Amazon's Rings of Power series has this massive budget, and it promised to deliver a prelude to the Lord of the Rings, but ultimately feels like a pale imitation of the Peter Jackson films. The show suffers from lazy writing and relies too heavily on familiar tropes, and has taken far too many cues from Jackson's work without offering much in terms of fresh storytelling. So, here's why Rings of Power comes off of both a derivative piece of fan fiction and an uninspired retread of Tolkien's Legendarium. From the start, the show writers portray an unwillingness to dive deep into the rich world of Tolkien and Middle-earth. Instead of exploring the complex histories and themes and cultures of the Second Age, the Rings of Power reduces these elements to surface-level drama. These plots fall back on familiar good versus evil storytelling without offering little nuance or depth, instead creating a story that's more designed for shippers and people that want to get off to it. Characters like Galadriel, who should embody wisdom and ancient experience, are flattened into one-dimensional action heroes, stripping away from what makes them so interesting in the first place. In contrast, Tolkien's world is filled with ambiguity, richly textured characters, a strong sense of good versus evil, a moral complexity, and Rings of Power bypasses this complexity in favour of this almost simplistic, cartoonish portrayal of Middle-earth. The lazy approach robs the series of gravitas and defines the original work. Instead caters to a modern blockbuster experience without adding anything particularly meaningful, ultimately feeling like a shallow rip-off rather than anything particularly original. There are many glaring issues with this show, and one that always screams out to me, it relies very heavily on the Peter Jackson's films. I get it. Sweeping landscapes, beautiful scenery. That's a given in any Tolkien's work. But if you want the honest truth, the mimicry of the beautiful soundtrack feels like a shallow, poor imitation rather than original creation. Also, the writing and story beats, leaning very heavily into the Fellowship of the Ring for Season 1, and definitely bringing in more elements of the Fellowship and the Two Towers for Season 2. It often feels like a fan film. Jackson's adaptations, particularly the Lord of the Rings trilogy, are beloved because they interpret Tolkien's world through a distant lens, with a deep respect for the source material's complexity. By borrowing heavily from the Jackson films, the Rings of Power fails to establish its own identity, and instead feels like a pale imitation, sitting in the shadow of its predecessor, trying to replicate the magic of the movies without adding anything particularly new to that mix. The derivative of this series just really frustrates me in ways that most people don't realise. At its core, Rings of Power is derivative in the worst way. It attempts to bring a grandeur to Tolkien's Second Age, and it attempts to bring it to life, but does it without passion or understanding what made both Tolkien's books and the Jackson films resonate with audience. The show leans on recognisable characters, settings and moments, seemingly afraid to take risks or stray too far from a preset template. The derivative style of this I see a lot, and it does happen. Prequels often suffer from this. It leans too heavily into the Peter Jackson movies, but shows no respect for the Tolkien works. Instead of exploring the new corners of Middle-earth or diving into these beautiful epic themes, the series honestly just reminds viewers of why they love The Lord of the Rings. From the sweeping vistas to noble heroes, but in doing so, it inevitably highlights its own shortcomings. There's a sense of creative laziness in the reliance on nostalgia, as the showrunners believe, and I'm pretty sure of this, that by echoing the Jackson movies, they could cast their legacy without having to craft something truly innovative. While Rings of Power may boast high production values and some impressive visual, it ultimately falls flat due to its lazy writing, unoriginal approach, and over-reliance on replicating the Peter Jackson magic, rather than forging its own path in Middle-earth, rather than creating something new and telling us a beautiful epic story of Middle-earth. It feels almost like it's riding on the tailcoats of what came before. The lack of imagination and creativity make Rings of Power a disappointment, and honestly, feels derivative, feels lazy, doesn't paint anything particularly new, but there it is. The Rings of Power. The rings of what? Lazy, boring, derivative of many other things, and even borrowing heavily from scripts and lines. The Rings of Power was always doomed to fail, partly because they hired people that were, bad robot cast-offs that had no success, actors with little weight or gravitas, and honestly, this show is a poor imitation of what came before. While there are issues with the Peter Jackson movies, this show fails to deliver its promise of creating something and truly respectful of Tolkien's Second Age. Instead, they wanted to create something new and just use the Tolkien IP as a cash cow.